They say words can cut deeper than a knife. I learned that in the most humiliating way back in 1990. We were sitting around the dinner table. Me, my daughter Emily, her husband Greg, and their 2 children, Michael and Sarah. The smell of roast chicken filled the air, the clinking of silverware echoed in the room, and for a moment, it felt like a normal family gathering. Until Greg decided to turn me into the evening's entertainment. He leaned back in his chair, puffing out his chest the way he always did when he wanted to feel superior. He was in his early 30s then, working as a manager at a growing tech company, and he thought he had the world figured out. He looked at Emily, then back at me, and with a grin that made my stomach turn, he said, "Don't listen to old people with failed businesses. They don't have anything useful to teach." The words hung in the air like poison. Emily froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. The kids looked down at their plates, too young to understand, but sensing the tension. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel the heat rise up my neck. And yet, I said nothing. I looked at him across the table, at that smug grin, at the man who married my daughter, the father of my grandchildren, and I forced a smile. "I suppose we all fail at something, Greg," I said quietly. My voice was calm, but inside I was bleeding. See, what Greg didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that while he was busy mocking me, I was quietly funding his children's education. Every month, I sent checks to cover Michael and Sarah's private school tuition. I didn't do it for Greg. I did it for Emily, my only child, and for those 2 kids who deserved opportunities I never had. But to sit there, hearing him strip away my dignity in front of my family, in front of my grandchildren, that cut deep. Because he didn't just insult my past, he dismissed my worth as a man. He wanted to paint me as a relic, someone whose failures made him laugh instead of someone whose sacrifices kept his family afloat. I could have told him, right then and there. I could have slammed my fist on the table and shouted, "You're only standing tall because I'm holding you up." But I didn't. Because my daughter's smile mattered more than my pride. Because my grandchildren's education mattered more than proving myself right. So I swallowed my anger, as I had so many times before, and I let him believe his own story. What's strange is that silence can be more powerful than shouting. I learned that night that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in striking back, it's in waiting. Years rolled on, and Greg's arrogance only grew. He kept his high-paying job, climbed the corporate ladder, bought a big house, and walked around like he'd earned it all on his own. And I stayed in the shadows, writing those tuition checks, pretending his words hadn't scarred me. But scars have a way of reminding you where you've been, and I never forgot that night in 1990, when my son-in-law mocked me at my own table. Fast forward to last week. The phone rang, and when I picked up, I heard a voice I barely recognized, Greg's. Except this time, there was no arrogance, no smugness, no superiority in his tone. His voice cracked as he said, "Walter, I don't know who else to turn to. I need your help." The same man who once told me I had nothing to offer was suddenly asking me for everything. And my answer wasn't what he expected. I told him, "Ask someone who never failed." And in that moment, 30 years of silence found its voice. When I look back at my younger years, I sometimes wonder if I was destined to fail, or if failure was simply the price of taking risks. I wasn't born into wealth, but I was born with ambition. For most of my life, I poured every ounce of energy into a small hardware store I built from the ground up. I named it Hayes Hardware, after my father, who used to tell me, "Son, if you work with your hands and your heart, you'll never go hungry." For a while, that felt true. The store was more than just a business. It was a part of the neighborhood. Saturdays were busy. People came not just to buy tools, but to hear my advice, to ask me what kind of drill would last or how to fix a leaky pipe. I had regulars who stopped by even when they didn't need anything, just to chat. That store gave me pride, identity, and a sense of purpose. But pride has a way of slipping through your fingers. By the late 1980s, the economy shifted. Big box chains rolled into town, and my little shop couldn't compete with their prices. I tried everything: discounts, promotions, late nights balancing the books, but it wasn't enough. In 1988, I shut the doors for the last time. I can still remember the way the keys felt in my hand as I locked up, knowing I was walking away from more than just a business. I was walking away from the dream I'd spent 2 decades building. To the world, I became another failed shop owner. To my family, I tried to keep a brave face, but inside, the shame was heavy. People don't talk about it enough, the way failure eats at you long after the bills are settled. I'd wake up at night sweating, hearing the echoes of conversations I once had with customers, imagining them laughing at me now. The only bright spot in my life was my daughter, Emily. She had a way of making me feel like I was still worth something, even when I didn't believe it myself. She'd grown up watching me run the store, helping out at the counter after school, and she always told me she admired my work ethic. She used to say, "Dad, one day I want my kids to know how hard you worked for us." When she married Greg Turner, I did my best to be supportive. Greg was polished, educated, and ambitious. The kind of man who looked like success came easy to him. He was climbing the ladder at a rising tech company, and he liked to talk about his achievements, sometimes too much. Emily was in love, and I wasn't going to stand in the way of her happiness. Still, I could see cracks in Greg's character. He was proud to a fault, dismissive of anyone he thought beneath him. I tried to overlook it for Emily's sake. When their children, Michael and Sarah, were born, I saw my chance at redemption. Maybe I couldn't give my daughter everything I wanted, but I could give my grandchildren opportunities. So, quietly, without fanfare, I started covering their tuition. I knew Greg's salary was good, but private school wasn't cheap, and Emily once mentioned they were stretching themselves thin. I had saved some money after selling the shop and later invested carefully in bonds and stocks. It wasn't flashy, but it was steady. That money, which could have gone to rebuild my pride, went instead to the future of 2 little children who meant the world to me. And yet, while I was sacrificing silently, Greg was sharpening his tongue. At dinners, he'd make comments about real businessmen or drop jokes about people who couldn't handle competition. He thought I didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care, but I noticed. Emily always tried to smooth things over, whispering, "Dad, ignore him. He doesn't mean it." But I knew he meant every word. I kept quiet because speaking up would have shifted the weight onto Emily. She was torn enough already, caught between a father who had stumbled and a husband who pretended he'd never fall. I thought I could bear the silence for her sake. I thought if I just stayed in the background, helped where I could, it would be enough. But the truth is, every insult chipped away at me. It wasn't just about pride, it was about dignity. It was about feeling like a man who once built something with his bare hands, but was now treated like he had nothing to offer. And that was my world before the moment that would change everything. The world where my worth was hidden in shadows, and my sacrifices were invisible. The stage was set. I just didn't know yet how quickly it would all come crashing back to the surface. The years after that dinner in 1990 didn't soften Greg's attitude toward me. They hardened it. His career kept climbing, and with each new promotion his voice grew louder and his laughter sharper whenever he spoke about me. At family gatherings it became almost predictable. A glass of wine in his hand, that smug smirk on his face, and then some remark that would slice through the room. One Thanksgiving, I remember sitting at the table while the grandkids ran around the living room, their laughter filling the house. Emily was carving the turkey, and Greg leaned back in his chair, talking about how his company had just closed a big deal. Everyone congratulated him, and then his eyes slid over to me. "You know," he said, pointing his fork in my direction, "business is really about adapting. Some people can't handle change, and they go under. Like your dad's store, Emily." He chuckled, shaking his head as if it were a funny anecdote, not a scar I carried every day. Emily's face went pale. "Greg," she said softly, "that's enough." But Greg waved her off. "No, no, I'm just saying. We should learn from it. Right, Walter? You'd agree failure is a pretty good teacher." I forced a smile, the same way I always did, and said, "Yes, Greg. Failure teaches you lessons success never will." Inside, though, I felt like I was shrinking, like I was becoming smaller and smaller in the eyes of my own family. What Greg never realized was that while he mocked me, I was quietly making sure his children never had to feel the sting of lost opportunity. Every month, I wrote those tuition checks. Every month, I sacrificed pieces of my pride to make sure Michael and Sarah had the best education possible. I'd watch them proudly show me their school projects, their report cards, their trophies, and I'd smile, knowing I had played a part in it, even if no one knew. But keeping that secret wasn't easy. There were nights I sat alone, wondering why I let him walk all over me. Why I let his words brand me as a failure in front of my daughter and grandchildren. Part of me wanted to shout the truth, to tell Emily, "I'm the reason your kids are thriving, not Greg, me." And yet, I stayed silent. Not because I was weak, but because I couldn't bear the thought of taking away her peace. Emily loved her husband, flaws and all. If she knew how deeply he disrespected me, it would tear her apart. She was already caught between us, between the father who had stumbled and the husband who thought he'd never fall. So, I let Greg believe his own lies. I let him wear the crown of success, while I wore the mask of failure. But the more he gloated, the heavier the weight grew inside me. Each insult wasn't just a jab at my past, it was a reminder of the sacrifice I was making in silence. I was feeding his children's future, while he was starving me of dignity. One evening, after another round of Greg's barbs, Emily pulled me aside. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Dad, why don't you ever say anything back? Why do you just let him talk to you that way?" I took her hand and said, "Because, sweetheart, sometimes silence is the only way to keep peace. You don't need another fight in your home." She hugged me tightly, but I could feel the guilt in her embrace. She knew I was swallowing my pride for her sake. That was the conflict that lived in me for decades, the choice between protecting my dignity or protecting my daughter's happiness. And every time Greg opened his mouth, that choice cut deeper. But the truth about conflict is that it never stays buried. It builds layer by layer, until the weight of it forces something to break. And as much as I tried to hold it all inside, I knew one day the silence would end. It was a gray Tuesday morning when the call came. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee from the same chipped mug I'd used for years, when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but when I answered, the voice on the other end nearly stopped my heart. "Walter, it's me. It's Greg." His voice was different. Gone was the booming confidence, the smug arrogance I'd come to expect. This voice was shaky, cracked, almost pleading. For a moment I wondered if I had misheard. But then he cleared his throat and said, I don't know who else to call." I leaned back in my chair, silent. After decades of being dismissed, of swallowing insult after insult, here he was, reaching out to me. "What's going on?" I asked. He hesitated. I could hear him take a deep breath before the words tumbled out. "I lost my job, Walter. The company downsized. I was one of the first to go. We're behind on the mortgage, the kids' tuition is due, and his voice broke. "I don't know what to do." For a long moment I said nothing. My mind replayed every dinner table insult, every Thanksgiving jab, every moment he used my past to prop up his pride. I could almost hear his mocking words echoing in my kitchen. "Don't listen to old people with failed businesses." Part of me wanted to hang up, to tell him I had nothing left for him. But another part, the father in me, the grandfather in me, couldn't ignore the pain in his voice. Because behind his desperation was Emily's worry, Michael's future, Sarah's dreams. They were the ones I had always been protecting. So I said quietly, "Come over, Greg. We need to talk in person." When I hung up, I sat there staring at the phone, my coffee growing cold. My hands trembled, not from anger, but from the weight of the decision I knew I was about to make. For 30 years, I had carried the burden of silence. Now, the moment had come to decide whether that silence would end. That evening, Greg came to my house. He didn't stride in with his usual confidence. His shoulders sagged, his tie was loose, and there were dark circles under his eyes. For the first time, he looked small. We sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where I had once done my books for the hardware store. He looked around the room, almost nervous, and then blurted out, "Walter, I need your help. I know I haven't always treated you the way I should have, but I'm desperate. Emily doesn't know how bad it is. If we don't come up with something soon, we could lose the house. The kids could—" He stopped, his voice cracking. "I can't let them down." I watched him closely. This was the man who had mocked me, belittled me, stripped me of my dignity in front of my family. And now he was crumbling before me, asking for the very thing he once claimed I had nothing to give. In that moment, I had a choice. I could continue to protect Emily by keeping the peace, silently writing another check, bailing him out yet again. Or I could finally reveal the truth and reclaim the dignity I had sacrificed all those years ago. I thought of Emily's face when she asked me why I never defended myself. I thought of Michael and Sarah, who would one day learn what kind of man their grandfather really was. And I thought of the long nights I spent awake, replaying his insults in my head, wishing I had spoken up. I straightened my back, feeling a steadiness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. This was the moment. The silence was about to end. "Greg," I said, my voice calm but firm, "before I decide anything, there's something you need to know." He looked at me, confusion flickering across his face. "This isn't the first time I've helped your family. For years, I've been paying for Michael and Sarah's education. Every check, every tuition bill, you've had me to thank, though I never said a word." His mouth fell open. He blinked, as if he hadn't heard me correctly. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "You mocked me, Greg. You called me a failure. But all this time, while you laughed, I was the one making sure your children had the future you bragged about." Silence filled the kitchen, heavier than any insult he had ever thrown. And in that silence I knew the decision was made. Greg sat across from me at my kitchen table, his hands shaking as he tried to process what I had just told him. For a man who had always been quick with a comeback, quick with a smug remark, he suddenly looked like a boy caught in a lie. His mouth opened, then closed, like he was trying to find the right words, but none would come. You paid for their school?" he finally stammered. I nodded slowly. "Every month, for years. While you bragged about success, while you mocked my failures, I was making sure Michael and Sarah had the best education you could never have afforded on your own." His eyes darted to the floor. He couldn't look at me. The silence stretched between us, thick, uncomfortable, almost suffocating. And for the first time in 30 years, I didn't fill that silence. I let it sit. I let him feel the weight of it. Emily walked in just then, her eyes scanning the room. She must have sensed the tension in the air. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. I turned to her, my heart heavy but steady. "Emily, I never told you this because I didn't want to come between you and your husband. But I think you should know. Your father has been paying for your children's education all these years." Her hand flew to her mouth. "Dad? What?" I nodded. "It's true. Every tuition bill, every semester, I've been the one writing the checks." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She looked from me to Greg, her lips trembling. "Greg, did you know this?" He shook his head quickly, almost violently. No, I didn't." And that's when it happened. The moment I had waited for, though I never admitted it, even to myself. The moment when the truth stripped Greg bare. I leaned forward, my voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the years of humiliation. Greg, you mocked me at my own table. You called me a failure in front of my daughter, in front of my grandchildren. You laughed at my losses, never realizing that you were living on my sacrifices. Every success you paraded in front of this family rested on a foundation you didn't even know existed. My foundation. Greg's face flushed red. His lips quivered as if he wanted to defend himself, but no words came. I stood, my hands gripping the back of the chair, my eyes locked on his. You came here tonight asking for help. But let me remind you of the words you once threw at me. Don't listen to old people with failed businesses. I let that memory hang in the air, savoring the way his expression crumbled under its weight. Now you need me. And do you know what I say to you, Greg? My voice was firm, unshaken. Ask someone who never failed. The room went silent. Emily gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. Greg sat frozen, his pride shattered into pieces too small to gather. For years, I had been the quiet man in the corner, the one who let the insults roll off, the one who protected peace at the cost of his dignity. But in that moment, the balance shifted. I wasn't the failure, I wasn't the weak one. I was the man who had carried this family on his back while being mocked for stumbling. Greg buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I knew he was crying. The same man who once laughed at me was now reduced to silence, stripped of his arrogance. Emily walked over and placed her hand on my arm. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Dad, I never knew. I'm so sorry." I put my hand over hers and smiled faintly. You didn't need to know. All that mattered was that Michael and Sarah had a future. And then I looked back at Greg, who still sat hunched over, broken. You wanted to measure a man by his failures, Greg. But let me tell you something, you don't measure a man by how he falls. You measure him by how he carries others when they can't walk on their own. That was the truth he could never take away from me. For the first time in decades, I felt lighter, not because I had hurt him, but because I had finally spoken, because I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, and the respect I had silently earned all along. After Greg left that night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I sat at the kitchen table long after the door shut, staring at the same walls that had heard years of my silence. But this time, it felt different. For the first time in decades, I wasn't carrying the weight of unspoken words. I had finally said what needed to be said. Emily sat across from me, her eyes red from crying. She reached for my hand and held it tightly, like she was afraid I'd slip away if she let go. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why carry that all alone?" I looked at her, my daughter who had always been the light in my life, and I said, "Because I wanted you to have peace. I wanted you to love your husband without seeing the cracks I saw. I wanted Michael and Sarah to look up to their father without knowing their grandfather was the one standing behind the curtain. My pride wasn't as important as your happiness." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "But you suffered, Dad. You let him walk all over you." I smiled faintly, though my chest ached. Sometimes suffering quietly is the price of love. But don't mistake silence for weakness, Emily. I wasn't weak. I was choosing. Choosing you. Choosing them. She pressed her forehead against my hand, and in that moment I knew she finally understood. Not everything, but enough. Enough to see the difference between being mocked and being powerless. As for Greg, we didn't speak for weeks after that night. He avoided me, ashamed, perhaps angry at himself. Emily told me he was struggling, not just with the loss of his job, but with the realization that the foundation he thought he built alone had always been partly mine. Pride is a heavy thing to lose. And yet, I didn't feel triumphant. That wasn't the point. I hadn't spoken my truth to destroy him. I had spoken it because I couldn't carry the silence anymore. Because sometimes the greatest lesson isn't in protecting peace, but in showing people the truth of who you are. One Sunday afternoon, weeks later, I was sitting on the porch when Greg pulled into the driveway. He walked slowly toward me. No arrogance in his stride, no smirk on his lips. He looked older, heavier, as if the weight of his choices had finally caught up to him. He stood there for a moment, shifting uncomfortably before he finally said, "Walter, I was wrong. About you, about everything. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to say it." I studied him, the man who had once been so sure of himself, now stripped down to humility. And I said, "Greg, failure isn't the worst thing that can happen to a man. The worst thing is never learning from it. If you want forgiveness, show me you've learned." He nodded, eyes downcast, and for the first time, I believed he might actually understand. The truth is, life has a way of humbling us all. Some of us learn it early, some late. Greg learned it the hard way. I learned it when I lost my store. But what I carried with me after that night wasn't bitterness, it was freedom. I no longer had to hide my worth or swallow my dignity to protect others. I had spoken my truth, and it had set me free. To anyone listening to my story, let me tell you this. Success isn't about the size of your paycheck or the titles you collect. It isn't about who laughs the loudest at the dinner table. Success is measured by the lives you lift, the sacrifices you make in silence, and the love you give without expecting applause. I failed in business, yes. I lost a store, a dream, a piece of my pride. But I never failed in love. I never failed my daughter. I never failed my grandchildren. And in the end, that's the only legacy that matters. So when people mock you, when they call you a failure, remember this. Failure doesn't define you. What defines you is what you choose to do after. Do you get bitter, or do you get wiser? Do you tear others down, or do you lift them up? As I sat there on the porch, watching the sunset behind the trees, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Not because Greg had finally admitted his wrongs, but because I had finally reclaimed my voice. And if there's one thing I hope my story leaves behind, it's this lesson. Never underestimate the quiet strength of the people you dismiss. Sometimes the ones you mock are the very ones who have been carrying you all along. And that's my story. A story about failure, pride, sacrifice, and the unexpected ways life humbles us all. If you take anything away from it, let it be this. Failing in business, in work, or in life doesn't make you worthless. What matters is how you rise, how you love, and how you choose to carry others when they need you most. I carried my family in silence for years, and for a long time I thought that silence made me invisible. But in the end, it showed me something far more powerful. Real strength isn't loud. Real strength doesn't boast. Real strength is quiet, steady, and unshakable. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever carried someone quietly, without them knowing, only to later reveal the truth? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to know your experiences. And if this story spoke to you, if it moved you, or made you think differently about failure, then please, give this video a like. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that strength doesn't always look the way we expect. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Because every week I share stories like this. Stories that remind us who we are, where we've been, and what really matters. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, remember, you're stronger than your failures, and your story isn't over yet.